Part 5, The Defiance. The scout ship traveled through dead space for 6 days before they found the first ruins. A space station drifted in the darkness, perfectly preserved but completely empty. Lights still functioned. Life support still hummed. But there was no life. This was a trading hub, Minho said, reading the data from his console. According to the database, it served 12 different species. Estimated population was around 50,000. Ha-Jun said quietly from the pilot seat. Past tense. They moved past the station slowly, sensors recording everything. Vexra watched the view screen and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The station looked ready for its inhabitants to return at any moment. Coffee cups sat on tables. Personal items floated in living quarters. A child's toy drifted past one viewport. It's like they all just stopped, one of the crew members whispered. They did, Minho confirmed. That's exactly what happened. They passed more ruins over the next 2 days. Colonies, ships, orbital habitats. All perfectly preserved, all completely lifeless. It was like flying through a museum of civilizations that had simply forgotten how to continue. I'm detecting something ahead, Ha-Jun announced on the 3rd day. Massive spatial distortion. Energy readings are off the charts, but they're not like anything I've seen before. That's it, Minho said, his voice tight. That's the Devourer. They approached cautiously, keeping the ship's sensors at maximum. The view screen showed a region of space that seemed wrong somehow. It wasn't empty exactly, but it wasn't full either. It was like looking at a hole in reality itself, a space where meaning had been erased. I can feel it already, Vexra said, surprised by the admission. A strange heaviness had settled in her mind, a whisper of questions she hadn't thought to ask. Why was she here? What was the point? Wouldn't it be easier to just stop trying? Everyone activate your training protocols, Sunho ordered calmly. Remember what Isolde taught us. Vexra closed her eyes and thought of something petty that made her angry. A colleague who had taken credit for her work years ago. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but the anger was real. She held on to that feeling like a lifeline. I'm getting detailed readings now, Minho reported, his fingers flying across his console even as his voice shook slightly. The Devourer isn't a creature or a ship. It's a field effect. It interacts with quantum consciousness patterns somehow. When it touches a mind, it amplifies doubt and strips away emotional justifications for existence. Can we block it? Ha-Jun asked, gripping the controls tighter. The humans learn to resist it through emotional resilience, Minho replied. But I don't know if that's enough to defend against direct exposure. The whispers in Vexra's mind grew stronger. Why continue? Why struggle? In the vast scale of the universe, nothing any individual did mattered. All accomplishments faded. All victories were temporary. Why not simply rest? No, Vexra said aloud, surprising herself. Because I say so. That's why. It was illogical. It was irrational. It was the most human thing she had ever said. And it helped. Beside her, other crew members were fighting their own battles. One officer had stopped working, staring at nothing. Another was curled up in her seat, trembling. But Ha-Jun and Minho kept functioning, their human training giving them resistance. Sunho helped them, Ha-Jun called out. The guard captain moved through the ship, going to each affected crew member. Listen to me, he said firmly. I need you to think of something that makes you angry. Something small and stupid. Hold on to that feeling. Let it be your anchor. Why should I? One officer asked, his voice hollow. Anger is illogical. So is life, Sunho replied. So is hope. So is getting up every morning and deciding to keep going. But we do it anyway, because we're too stubborn not to. Slowly, painfully, the crew began to recover. They weren't fighting the Devourer with logic or reason. They were fighting it with spite, with stubbornness, with the purely emotional determination to refuse to give in. I've got the data we need, Minho announced. I understand how it works now. The Devourer targets complex philosophical frameworks. It attacks the sophisticated reasons civilizations develop for existing. The more developed your culture's understanding of purpose and meaning, the easier it is for the Devourer to dismantle it. But humans never developed those sophisticated frameworks, Vexra realized. Your philosophy has always been more emotional than logical. We know we don't make sense, Ha-Jun agreed with a tight smile. We've always known that. So when something tells us existence is meaningless, we just shrug and keep going anyway. I think I can create a defense, Minho said, working frantically at his console. If we can generate a broadcast pattern that mimics human neural responses, it might create interference. Not a shield exactly, but noise that makes it harder for the devourer to affect consciousness. How do we test it? Vexra asked. We broadcast it and see if we survive, Minho replied grimly. But before they could activate anything, alarms started blaring. The devourer was moving. The spatial distortion was expanding, reaching toward their ship with terrible purpose. It's noticed us, Hajun said, his hands moving quickly across the pilot controls. And it's not happy about it. The whispers became a roar in Vexra's mind. The devourer was focusing its full attention on them, and the pressure was overwhelming. She saw her crew members freezing again, their resistance crumbling under the weight of absolute existential doubt. Broadcast the interference pattern now, Vexra ordered. Minho slammed his hand down on the control. The ship's communication systems activated at full power, broadcasting a signal based on human neural patterns. It pulsed out into space, a declaration of stubborn, irrational, emotional defiance, and something impossible happened. The devourer recoiled. For the first time in recorded history, the entity that had destroyed countless civilizations pulled back. The spatial distortion rippled like something in pain or confusion. The whispers in Vexra's mind stuttered and faded. It's working, Minho breathed in disbelief. The interference pattern is confusing it. It doesn't know how to process pure emotional defiance. We need to leave, now, Sunho said urgently, before it adapts. Agreed. Hajun pulled the ship around, pointing them back toward New Haven. Everyone hold on. But the devourer was already adapting. The spatial distortion began moving again, faster this time, trying to catch them before they could escape. The whispers returned, stronger and more focused. We're not going to make it to jump distance, Hajun said, watching the rapidly approaching threat on his sensors. Then we give it something else to think about, Vexra decided. She activated the ship-wide communication system. Everyone, I need you to focus. Think of every petty grievance you've ever had, every small annoyance, every stupid reason you've ever been angry, and broadcast it. Feel it as loudly as you can. It was ridiculous. It was absurd. It was the least scientific thing Vexra had ever ordered, but it worked. The crew focused their thoughts on traffic jams and broken equipment and people who chewed too loudly and food that wasn't quite right and 1,000 other meaningless frustrations. They felt these small angers with full intensity, not because they were important but because they were real. The interference pattern strengthened. The devourer's approach slowed, then stopped. The entity seemed to thrash against the noise of pure, illogical human-style emotion. Jump distance achieved, Hajun announced. Engaging hyperdrive. The ship leaped into hyperspace, leaving the devourer behind. In the sudden silence, the crew sat in their seats, breathing heavily, hardly believing they had survived. Did we just fight off an existential threat with spite? One officer asked. Yes, Vexra confirmed. Yes, we did. The journey back to New Haven took 3 days. They spent that time analyzing their data, refining their understanding of the devourer and how to resist it. Minho worked with the ship's computer to perfect the interference pattern, creating a broadcast that could protect entire populations. When they finally arrived back in the system, they found both the Eternal Reach and a hastily assembled human defense fleet waiting nervously. Welcome back. Administrator Hyun's voice came through the communication system. We were starting to worry. We have news, Vexra replied. Both good and bad. They docked at New Haven's orbital station and immediately called an emergency meeting with both human and Imperial leadership. Vexra stood before the assembled group and delivered their findings. The devourer is real, it's active, and it's coming, she said bluntly. But we've found a way to resist it. The key is teaching civilizations to embrace emotional thinking alongside logical thought. To value stubbornness and spite and irrational hope. You're proposing we change how entire species think? Council Speaker Veth asked via holographic connection. I'm proposing we teach them to think like humans sometimes, Vexra replied, because 50,000 years of human survival proves that emotional defiance works against this threat. Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation began. The Dalvinian High Council, finally convinced by the data Vexra brought back, approved the Treaty of Defiance. It was a formal alliance between the Empire and the human collective, dedicated to defending against the devourer and spreading resistance techniques across the galaxy. Human instructors traveled to Imperial worlds, teaching the art of spite training. Part 4. The Choice. The emergency transmission reached the Dalvinian High Council 3 weeks after Vexra sent it. The response came back 2 weeks later, and when it arrived, Vexra could hear the confusion and disagreement even through the formal diplomatic language. She sat in the conference room aboard the Eternal Reach with Hyun and her council, playing the recorded message from the Empire. The holographic projection showed the High Council chamber, where representatives from dozens of species argued among themselves. The discovery of surviving humans is remarkable, Council Speaker Veth stated, trying to maintain order. But the claims about this devourer entity require extraordinary evidence. We cannot make decisions that will affect billions of lives based on ancient recordings and theoretical threats. The projection showed different factions of the Council presenting their positions. The scientific faction wanted to establish research stations and study both the humans and the historical data about the devourer. The military faction wanted to evacuate the human colony immediately and prepare defense systems across Imperial space. The isolationist faction wanted to quarantine the entire sector and classify all information about it. They don't believe us, Minho said quietly as the recording played. They don't know what to believe, Vexra corrected. They've never seen what we've seen. The Great Silence is ancient history to them, something that happened so long ago it might as well be mythology. The recording continued. Arguments grew heated. Some council members demanded Vexra return immediately with proof. Others wanted her to stay and gather more data. A few suggested that the humans themselves might be dangerous, that perhaps they had caused the Great Silence and were now lying about it. That last part is insulting, Jiwon said, her voice tight with controlled anger. That's fear talking, Hyun replied calmly. Fear makes people look for someone to blame. The recording ended with no clear decision from the council. They ordered Vexra to continue her investigation while they debated further. It was the worst possible response. No action, no commitment, just more waiting while the threat grew closer. What about your people? Vexra asked, turning to Hyun. What are they saying? Hyun pulled up a data display showing results from the planetary referendum they had held. The human population had been voting for the past week on how to respond to contact with the Empire. We're divided, Hyun admitted. 42% want to join the galactic community. They're tired of hiding. They want to see the rest of the galaxy, to reconnect with other species to end our isolation after 50,000 years. She shifted the display. 38% want to maintain isolation. They fear that contact will doom both our civilizations. They want to send you away and hope the devourer doesn't find us. And the other 20%? Vexra asked. They want to fight, Jiwon answered. They believe hiding has only delayed the problem, not solved it. They think it's time to face the devourer directly and find a permanent solution. A young human man stepped forward. He wore the uniform of a shuttle pilot and carried himself with the confident energy of someone used to taking risks. I'm Ha-Jun, he introduced himself. I lead the faction that wants to fight, and I think I speak for most of them when I say we're tired of being afraid. Our ancestors ran. Our grandparents hid. But maybe it's time to stop running. Fighting is pointless if we don't understand what we're fighting, Minho interjected. The devourer isn't a physical enemy we can shoot or bomb. It's a phenomenon that attacks consciousness itself. Then we learn more about it, Ha-Jun countered. We study it. We figure out its weaknesses. We find a way to stop it. Ji-won stood and moved to a wall display, pulling up tactical maps. I've been thinking about this. If we're going to face the devourer, we need information, real data from close observation, not just sensor readings from a distance. You're suggesting a scouting mission, Vexra said, understanding immediately. Exactly, Ji-won confirmed. A small ship with a mixed crew, humans who know how to resist the devourer's influence, and Imperial citizens who can bring that knowledge back to the Empire. We approach carefully, gather data, and return before the entity fully notices us. That's incredibly dangerous, one of Vexra's officers protested. Everything about this situation is dangerous, Hyun pointed out. The question is whether we face that danger actively or passively. Vexra thought about the High Council's indecision, about the threat slowly approaching, about the 2 billion humans who had survived for 50,000 years through courage and determination. She thought about the Empire's billions who had no idea what might be coming for them. I'll volunteer for the mission, Vexra said firmly. If we're asking people to risk their lives, I should be willing to do the same. I'm going, Hajun said immediately. As am I, Minho added. If we're going to understand the Devourer, we need someone who has studied the historical data. I'll accompany you, Sunho, the guard captain, stepped forward. Someone needs to ensure you all make it back alive. Over the next 2 weeks, preparations moved forward despite uncertainty from both governments. A small, fast ship was prepared with the best sensors both humans and the Empire could provide. Shielding systems were installed based on human theories about protecting consciousness from the Devourer's influence. Medical officer Seojin worked with Imperial doctors to develop resistance training protocols. We've discovered something interesting, Seojin explained during a briefing. She displayed brain scans comparing humans and various Imperial species. Human neural patterns show unique characteristics. When exposed to questions about purpose and meaning, human brains activate emotional centers as strongly as logical ones. You literally feel your reasons for existing rather than just thinking them. And the Devourer seems to target logical thought patterns, Minho added, understanding immediately. It makes you question your existence logically, but logic alone can't provide an answer to why continue. The emotions can. Feelings can. Spite can. So we need to teach Imperial species to think more like humans? One of the scientists asked skeptically. Not think. Feel, Seojin corrected. We need to teach them to embrace emotional responses to existential questions, to value stubbornness over logic, to accept that some things don't need rational justification. Training began immediately. Vexra and the other Imperial volunteers worked with human instructors, who taught them meditation techniques that sounded completely ridiculous. Think of something that makes you angry, the instructor. A human woman named Isul told them. Not a big anger, a petty one. Someone who cut in line. A device that won't work properly. A food that's just slightly wrong. How does this help against an existential threat? One of Vexra's officers asked. Because petty anger is purely emotional, Isul explained. It has no logical basis, it just is. And when the Devourer makes you question why you exist, you need to be able to respond with something equally illogical. With I exist because I'm too stubborn not to. With I continue because giving up would let the universe win and I refuse to lose. Does that make sense? No, does it work? According to 50,000 years of human survival. Yes. In the engineering bay, Yunji worked with Imperial technicians to modify the scout ship. She installed redundant systems based on human survival technology. Everything was built to be repaired with basic tools. Every critical system had 3 backups. Fancy technology fails when you need it most, Yunji explained. Simple and reliable beats complex and fragile. Meanwhile, Administrator Hyun made a bold decision. She opened a direct communication channel to the Dalvinian High Council, bypassing normal diplomatic protocols. The council appeared on the holographic display, looking surprised and somewhat annoyed at the unauthorized contact. Members of the council, Hyun began, her voice steady and strong. I am Administrator Hyun of New Haven, representing 2 billion human survivors of the Great Silence. I speak to you now not as a petitioner seeking your approval, but as a fellow leader warning you of a threat that could destroy everything you've built. The council chamber fell silent. My people have lived in fear for 50,000 years, Hyun continued. We survived by hiding, by staying silent, by making ourselves small and hoping the darkness would pass us by. But I realize now that survival is not the same as living, and hiding from a threat does not make it go away. She stepped closer to the camera, her eyes intense. So I am proposing something different, not evacuation, not isolation, not hiding. I propose an alliance. The Dalvinian Empire and the human collective working together to face the Devourer. We have knowledge you need. You have resources we lack. Together we might accomplish what neither could alone. And if we refuse? Council Speaker Veth asked quietly. Then we all face the darkness alone, Hyun replied. And history suggests that doesn't end well. The transmission ended. Hyun turned to find her council watching her with expressions of surprise and approval. That was quite the ultimatum, Ji-won said. It was the truth, Hyun replied. And it's time the galaxy heard it. 2 days later, the scout ship was ready. The volunteer crew gathered in the hangar bay. Vexra representing the Empire, Hajun at the pilot controls, Minho to analyze data, and Sunho for security. A small crew, but one that represented both civilizations united by common purpose. Part 3. The warning. The elevator descended for what felt like forever. Vexra watched the depth counter click down, showing numbers that seemed impossible. They were going deep beneath the surface of New Haven, far deeper than any normal building would need. The Forbidden Archive, Hyun explained as they descended. We built it in the early days of the colony, when memories of the Great Silence were still fresh. Everything our ancestors knew about what happened, everything they learned during their escape, we stored it all here. Why so deep? One of Vexra's scientists asked. Because knowledge can be dangerous, Hyun replied, and because we wanted to make sure it survived no matter what happened on the surface. Even if the colony failed, even if everyone died, the truth would remain preserved for whoever came after us. The elevator stopped and doors slid open to reveal a vast underground chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, supported by massive pillars. Along the wall stood storage units containing countless data crystals, each one holding fragments of lost history. In the center of the chamber, a large holographic projector waited in silence. A young human stepped forward to greet them. He wore the simple white coat of a researcher and carried a data pad that glowed softly in the dim light. This is Kyung, Hyun introduced. He's our chief archivist. He'll guide you through what we know. Kyung bowed slightly, a gesture of respect. I must warn you, he said quietly. What you're about to see is disturbing. It shook my people to their core 50,000 years ago. It still haunts us today. We need to know, Vexra said firmly. If there's a threat to the Empire, we must understand it. Kyung nodded and activated the holographic projector. The air above it shimmered and resolved into an image of space, showing sectors marked with different colors representing various civilizations. This is the galaxy as it was 52,000 years ago, Kyung explained. Hundreds of species, thousands of colonies, all connected through trade and communication networks. It was a golden age of cooperation and growth. The image shifted, showing a timeline moving forward. Suddenly, in one corner of the map, a colony went dark. It started small, Kyung continued. One colony stopped responding to messages. Ships sent to investigate found the colony intact but empty, not destroyed, not evacuated, just empty. The people were there in their homes and workplaces, but they weren't moving, weren't eating, weren't doing anything. The hologram zoomed in to show footage from one of those early investigation ships. Vexra watched as rescue teams moved through silent streets, finding people standing or sitting in place, their eyes open but unseeing. The rescue teams tried to help, but the affected individuals didn't respond. Within hours, some of the rescue team members began showing the same symptoms. They called it the stillness at first, Kyung said, a mysterious illness that spread through contact. But it wasn't an illness. It was something else. The timeline continued. More colonies went dark, following patterns along communication routes. Species after species fell to the stillness. Some tried to quarantine themselves, but it didn't help. Some tried to flee into deep space, but the stillness followed. Within 3 generations, vast swaths of the galaxy had fallen silent. The last coherent reports came from a science station that had been monitoring the spread, Kyung said. The hologram showed a recording of a female alien scientist, her scales dulling with exhaustion and fear. It's not a disease, the scientist said in the recording. It's something that targets consciousness itself. It makes you question why you do anything, why you bother to continue. And once you start asking that question, once you really consider it, you can't find an answer that satisfies. Purpose drains away. Meaning becomes hollow. You simply stop. The recording ended. The hologram shifted to show sensor data from various sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. There was something moving through the galaxy, an entity or phenomenon that consumed the will to exist. It left bodies alive but minds empty. It preserved civilizations like insects in amber, perfect but lifeless. The humans called it the Devourer, Kyung said, because it devoured meaning itself. Vexra felt cold despite the stable temperature of the archive. How did humans escape? Kyung pulled up another recording, this one showing a human woman in a laboratory. She looked exhausted but determined, her eyes burning with fierce intelligence. This is Dr. Suji, Kyung explained. She was the one who figured out the pattern and convinced the colony initiative to launch early. In the recording, Suji was speaking rapidly, gesturing at data displays. It's following our connections, she said. Every trade route, every communication line, every link between worlds. It uses our civilization against us. The more connected we are, the faster it spreads. She leaned closer to the camera. I've convinced the Colony Council to authorize an emergency launch. 50 ships into dead space. No communication back. No links to the living galaxy. It's our only chance. The hologram showed the launch of the 50 colony ships. They jumped into hyperspace and emerged in the dead sector that would eventually hold New Haven. Then, deliberately, they destroyed their own long-range communications equipment. They cut themselves off completely, Kyung said. No signals out. No signals in. Complete isolation. But the Devourer still found them, Hyun added quietly. 3 months after they arrived in the system, it appeared. The hologram showed sensor readings of something approaching the hidden human fleet. It wasn't a ship or a creature. It was more like a distortion in space itself, a spreading field of emptiness. The colonists felt it immediately, Kyung said. That questioning. That doubt. Why were they running? What was the point? Why not just give in? The recording showed humans struggling against the Devourer's influence. Some stood frozen, their faces blank. Others curled up in corners, unable to move. The colony ships drifted aimlessly as more and more crew members fell to the stillness. But then something unexpected happened, Kyung said. And for the first time, there was a hint of pride in his voice. The hologram showed a human man standing on the bridge of his colony ship. Unlike the others, he was moving, working the controls with shaking hands. He was crying, but he was fighting. This is Captain Taman of the colony ship Defiant, the recording showed him saying. I don't know why we should continue. I can't think of a logical reason. The entity is right. Nothing we do matters in the grand scale of the universe. But you know what? I don't care. I'm angry. I'm stubborn. And I refuse to give up just because something tells me I should. Maybe that's stupid. Maybe that's illogical. But it's human. Other humans on his ship began to respond. They didn't have good reasons to continue. They just refused to stop. They embraced anger, spite, and stubborn determination as weapons against the existential emptiness. Slowly, the Devourer's influence weakened. Kyung explained. It seemed confused by human resistance. We theorize that it targets logical, ordered consciousness. But human emotion, especially emotions like spite and stubborn hope, create patterns it can't easily consume. We're too messy, too illogical, too determinedly irrational. The hologram showed the Devourer eventually withdrawing, moving away from the human colony. The crisis passed, though not without casualties. Nearly 5,000 humans had fallen to the stillness before the rest learned to resist. And that's why we stayed hidden, Hyun said. Because 5,000 years ago, when we finally felt safe enough to send out probes, we detected the Devourer again. It was dormant, quiet, but still active in deep space. We sent warnings to any civilization we could find, but we never received responses. We assumed everyone was gone. But the Empire survived, Vexra said slowly. We've been thriving for millennia. Why didn't the Devourer come for us? We don't know. Minho spoke up, stepping forward from where he'd been observing quietly. Maybe it moves in cycles. Maybe it feeds and then rests. Maybe the galaxy was too empty after the Great Silence and it went dormant, waiting for civilizations to rebuild. He paused. Or maybe it's been hunting isolated pockets of consciousness and the Empire simply got lucky. Kyung pulled up one final display. It showed recent sensor data from the probes humans had placed at the edges of their territory. 3 months ago we detected movement, Kyung said quietly. The Devourer is active again. And Commander Vexra, when your ship entered this sector, when you sent out those broad-spectrum communications, you lit up this region like a beacon. The hologram showed communication signals spreading outward from the eternal reach, traveling through space. And in the distance, something responded to those signals. Something turned its attention toward the source. The Devourer is coming, Yoon said flatly. Your arrival has drawn it here. And when you report back to your empire, when your vast communication networks light up with news of our discovery, you'll draw it to every world in your territory. Vexra stared at the hologram, watching the slow approach of something that had destroyed countless civilizations. Her diplomatic mission had suddenly become something far more serious. Far more dangerous. How long do we have? She asked. Based on its previous speed, perhaps 6 months before it reaches this system, Minho answered. Maybe a year before it could threaten Imperial space. Part 2. The Survivors. The shuttle descended through New Haven's atmosphere with barely a tremor. Vexra watched through the viewport as clouds parted to reveal the landscape below. Cities sprawled across continents in patterns that seemed both organic and planned. Green spaces mixed with buildings that reached toward the sky. Roads connected everything in efficient networks. From this height, it looked like any prosperous imperial world. But it wasn't. This was something the galaxy thought had been lost forever. "Landing coordinates received," the pilot announced. "They're guiding us to their Capitol building. There's a delegation waiting." The shuttle touched down on a landing pad made of smooth white stone that gleamed in the sunlight. As the engines powered down, Vexra stood and straightened her uniform. Her diplomatic team gathered behind her, checking recording equipment and preparing translation devices, though apparently none would be needed since the humans spoke Galactic Standard. The shuttle door opened. Warm air rushed in, carrying scents of growing things and distant water. Vexra stepped out onto the landing pad and stopped. A group of humans waited in a semicircle. They wore formal clothing in shades of blue and gray, simple but elegant. In the center stood Administrator Hyun, the woman from the video transmission. She was shorter than Vexra expected, with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Welcome to New Haven, Commander Vexra," Hyun said, stepping forward with one hand extended in what the database identified as a human greeting gesture. "We are honored by your visit." Vexra carefully grasped the offered hand, mimicking the up and down motion she had seen in archived footage. The human's grip was firm but not aggressive. "The honor is ours, Administrator," Vexra replied. "I must confess your existence here is unexpected." Hyun's mouth curved into a small smile. "I imagine it is. Please let me introduce my council." She gestured to the others. "This is Science Director Minho, Defense Coordinator Jiwon, and Historical Keeper Dabin." Each human nodded as their name was spoken. Minho was tall and thin with sharp eyes that seemed to be analyzing everything about the visitors. Jiwon stood with perfect posture, her movements controlled and purposeful in a way that reminded Vexra of military officers. Dabin was older, with gray streaking through his dark hair and a gentle expression that put Vexra somewhat at ease. "We've prepared a tour," Hyun continued. "We thought you might want to see our civilization before we discuss the more difficult topics." "That would be very welcome," Vexra agreed. They traveled by ground vehicle through the capital city. Vexra watched the streets pass by, noting everything. Humans walked along sidewalks, going about their daily business. Children played in parks under the watchful eyes of adults. Shops displayed goods behind clean windows. Everything seemed so normal, so peaceful, so alive. "How many humans are there?" Vexra asked. "In this system, about 2 billion, Minho answered from his seat across from her. "Spread across 5 planets and 11 major orbital stations. Our population has been stable for the last 1,000 years. 2 billion. Vexra tried to process that number. 2 billion survivors of a species the galaxy thought extinct. 2 billion people living their lives in secret for 50,000 years. We've built a sustainable civilization," Hyun explained. "Every resource is carefully managed. Every person has a purpose. We learned early that waste meant death, so we built a culture around efficiency and conservation." The vehicle stopped at a large building with wide steps leading to an entrance flanked by tall columns. "This is our Museum of Memory," Dabin said softly. "Here we keep the story of who we were and how we survived." Inside, the museum was cool and quiet. Displays lined the walls showing images and artifacts from human history. Vexra saw pictures of Earth, the human homeworld, with its blue oceans and green continents. She saw images of early human space travel, primitive by modern standards but remarkable for its time. She saw the expansion of humanity across the stars, the establishment of colonies, the first contact with other species, and then she saw the emptiness. "This section shows the Great Silence," Dabin explained, his voice heavy with old grief. "We don't know exactly what happened. Our ancestors weren't scientists studying the phenomenon. They were refugees running from it. The displays showed maps of space with colonies marked in bright colors. Then, sector by sector, the colors faded to black. Worlds went silent. Communication stopped. Ships stopped arriving. Within 3 generations, hundreds of thriving civilizations simply ceased to exist. A scientist named Suji detected a pattern." Dabin continued. She noticed that the silence was spreading along communication routes and trade networks. "She theorized that whatever was causing it used our connections against us. She convinced the colony initiative to launch 50 ships into dead space, into sectors marked as sterile and lifeless, places no one would look for survivors. How many people escaped? Vexra asked quietly. 40,000, Dabin replied. Out of billions. 40,000 humans on 50 ships, running into the dark with no idea if they would survive. The museum showed images of the colony ships, huge vessels designed to carry everything needed to start a new civilization. It showed the journey through empty space, the years of isolation, the fear and hope mixed together. It showed the arrival at this system and the desperate work to make it livable. Many died those first years, Dabin said. The colony ships were damaged from the long journey. Resources ran low. There were disagreements about how to proceed. But the survivors held together. They built shelters. They planted crops. They had children. And slowly, very slowly, they rebuilt. Vexra moved through the displays, seeing the progression of human history in this hidden place. Early struggles gave way to established settlements. Settlements grew into towns. Towns became cities. The humans adapted their technology to work with local resources, creating new solutions to old problems. We couldn't use many materials that were common in the old galaxy, Minho explained, so we had to innovate. Our technology looks different from yours because it's built from what we could find here. The tour continued to an engineering facility where a human named Yunji demonstrated their power systems. They used a combination of fusion reactors and solar collection, with backup systems built into backup systems. Everything was designed for reliability over efficiency. We learned that fancy technology fails when you can't get replacement parts, Yunji said with a slight smile. Simple and sturdy beats complex and fragile every time. At a military facility, Guard Captain Sunho showed them the human defense forces. The soldiers trained in hand-to-hand combat as well as with weapons, practicing movements that flowed like dance. We don't know if we'll ever need to fight, Sunho explained, but we train anyway. It keeps us disciplined. It reminds us that survival sometimes means being willing to struggle. As the sun began to set, they gathered in a conference room overlooking the city. Lights were coming on across New Haven, creating a pattern of brilliance against the growing darkness. Vexra sat at a long table with her team on one side and the Human Council on the other. I have so many questions, Vexra admitted, but the most important one is this. Why didn't you try to return? Why stay hidden for 50,000 years? The galaxy has been peaceful for millennia. You could have come back. Hyun exchanged glances with her council members. Something passed between them. Some shared knowledge that made them all look suddenly older and more tired. We sent probes out 5,000 years ago, Hyun said slowly, to check if the galaxy was safe, to see if we could finally go home. She paused, her hands folding together on the table. What we found, what we learned. That's why we stayed hidden. That's why we're afraid of what your arrival might mean. What did you find? Vexra asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Hyun met her eyes directly. We found that the Great Silence wasn't a natural disaster, Commander. It was an attack. And the thing that caused it? It's still out there. Still active. Still hungry? The room fell silent. Outside, the lights of New Haven sparkled peacefully. But Vexra suddenly understood the truth behind that peace. It wasn't the peace of safety. It was the peace of hiding, of holding very still and hoping the predator passed by without noticing. Part 1. The Discovery. The Eternal Reach dropped out of hyperspace with a shudder that ran through its massive frame. Commander Vexra steadied herself against the navigation console, her forearms moving with practiced efficiency across the controls. The ship's systems hummed back to life as they entered normal space, and the view screen flickered to show the vast emptiness before them. Location confirmed, announced the navigation officer, a thin creature with crystalline skin that reflected the console lights. Sector 447 Omega. Dead zone classification maintained for 51,247 years. Vexra nodded slowly. This was their third survey of the week, all routine checks of sectors that had been silent since before the Dalvinian Empire had even formed. Space was vast, and the Empire believed in thorough documentation. Every few decades, they sent ships to confirm that dead sectors remained dead. It was boring work, but necessary. Begin standard scanning protocols, Vexra ordered. Let's make this quick. I want to be back in living space before the weekends. The science station lit up with activity. Officers from a dozen different species worked together, their various appendages dancing over controls designed to accommodate every form the Empire encompassed. Sensors swept outward, probing the darkness for any sign of interest. Then the alarm started. "Commander," the chief science officer called out, his voice tight with confusion. "I'm getting impossible readings." Vexra moved to his station, peering at the data flowing across the screens. Her eyes widened. "Check your equipment. This has to be a malfunction." "Already did, Commander. 3 times. The readings are consistent." The screen showed energy signatures. Lots of them. Artificial structures. Electromagnetic radiation and communication frequencies. And most impossible of all, biological life signs. Thousands of them, millions. "That's not possible," Vexra said quietly. "This sector has been dead for over 50,000 years. We've checked it multiple times." "Commander, I'm detecting orbital structures around the 3rd planet," another officer reported, "and atmospheric processors. And cities. There are cities down there." The bridge fell silent. Every eye turned to the main view screen as it zoomed in on the 3rd planet in the system. The image resolved slowly, showing a blue and green world wrapped in white clouds. Lights dotted the night side in obvious patterns. Satellites orbited in organized grids. Ships moved between the planet and its 3 moons. "Is this some kind of imperial colony we forgot about?" someone asked. "Impossible," Vexra replied. "The Empire has never established colonies in dead sectors. It's against protocol. And these structures don't match any imperial architecture I've seen." "Should we retreat and report?" the navigation officer asked nervously. Vexra considered this. Protocol said to report any unexpected findings before making contact. But protocol was written for finding artifacts or natural phenomena, not living civilizations. This was something else entirely. This was first contact with an unknown species in a place where nothing should exist. "Open all standard communication frequencies," Vexra decided. "Broadcast the standard greeting protocols. Let's see if they respond." The communications officer worked quickly, sending out the Empire's first contact message across every frequency the ship could produce. It was a simple mathematical sequence followed by images showing the Empire's peaceful intentions. The message was designed to be understood by any species capable of radio technology. They waited. The bridge was so quiet that Vexra could hear the hum of the ship's engines and the soft breathing of her crew. Minutes passed like hours. Then the communications console beeped. "Response incoming, Commander," the communications officer said, his voice shaking slightly. It's in the old mathematical language, the one from the pre-Empire era. That language hasn't been used for 40,000 years, Vexra said. "Can you translate it?" "Working on it now. The computer is pulling from historical databases." A pause. "Translation complete." The message says, "Welcome. We've been expecting visitors and eventually..." Vexra felt a chill run through her body. Expecting visitors? Eventually? What did that mean? "Send a response," she ordered. "Ask who they are and request permission to send a diplomatic shuttle." More waiting. More silence. Then another message arrived, this time with video attached. The screen showed a being that looked almost familiar. 2 arms, 2 legs standing upright, smooth skin with minimal hair. The being wore simple but well-made clothing and stood in what appeared to be some kind of command center. "This is Chief Administrator Yoon of New Haven," the being said in perfect galactic standard, the common language of the Empire. Her voice was calm and measured. "We are human. We are survivors of the Great Silence. And yes, you may send a diplomatic party. We have much to discuss." The bridge erupted in shocked murmurs. The Great Silence. Every species in the Empire knew that term. It was the historical event that marked the end of the ancient era, when dozens of advanced civilizations simply vanished from the galaxy within a few generations. No one knew what caused it. No one knew where the lost species went. It was the great mystery of galactic history, and now apparently at least one of them had survived. "Humans," Vexra whispered. She accessed the ship's historical database and searched for the term. Information flooded her screen. Humans had been one of the most widespread species before the Great Silence, with colonies across multiple sectors. They had been known for their art, their music, their literature, and their strange tendency to form emotional bonds with nearly everything they encountered. They had been considered strange but harmless by other species, and then they had vanished with all the others, leaving behind empty stations and silent worlds. Vexra looked at the image of Administrator Hyun on the screen. The human looked back with eyes that seemed far older than her young face suggested. "Prepare a diplomatic shuttle," Vexra ordered. "Full delegation. Science team, cultural specialist, security escort. We're going down there." "Commander, shouldn't we report this to the High Council first?" the navigation officer asked. "We will," Vexra replied. "But first I want to know what we're reporting. If humans survived the Great Silence, if they've been living here in secret for 50,000 years, then this is the most important discovery in Imperial history. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we bring the entire Empire into this." The shuttle bay prepared for launch while the bridge crew sent a preliminary report back to Imperial space. It would take weeks for the message to reach the High Council, and weeks more for any response to return. For now, they were on their own. Vexra gathered her diplomatic team and headed to the shuttle bay. As they prepared to launch, she looked out at the blue planet below. Somewhere down there was a civilization that shouldn't exist, survivors of a catastrophe that had destroyed countless worlds, and answers to questions the Empire had been asking for millennia. The shuttle launched smoothly, cutting through space toward the unknown. Vexra watched the planet grow larger in the viewport and wondered what they would find. What had the humans survived? How had they stayed hidden for so long? And most importantly, what did they mean by expecting visitors eventually? The answers waited below, in the cities of a lost civilization that had somehow learned to thrive in the darkness.